disallowed by practically all other spaces in society. And this is probably something I value most and simultaneously find most difficult. I looked up and lost my place, pardon me. There we go. The space and willingness to be wrong and necessarily make oneself open to redirection and correction, which is so vital to the space of learning. And yes, this comes with the infuriating, the confusing, and the even harmful elements of the classroom, not to mention the unsettled feelings that I often leave with and then think about what I might have said or done differently in the 2 to 4 business days after class. If all of this comes across as convoluted, my apologies. I think I'm struggling to come to terms with a kind of ending. So to go back to the beginning, I had a slightly unconventional route through undergrad and didn't take a gender and sexuality studies course until I was a junior and 23. Returning to college after time away gave me time to get over myself and the idea that studying gender could only amount to navel-gazing me search, or I simply stopped caring that it might be. This first class was Gender and Society, taught by then PhD student Davy Knittle. And I could talk at length about the transformative nature of this class, but given the fact that Davy's sitting right there and I don't want to make us that uncomfortable, and amid the existential anxiety of coming to the end of coursework, a particular element has been rolling around in my head, which is how that class taught me to be a student in a classroom. I, like I think many students in gender and sexuality studies, come curious as to how much of myself I wanted to bring into the classroom and how much I wanted to quietly keep as mine. In a class that thought so much about the social and spatial constructions of the everyday, I was invited to think about myself in relation to multiple overlapping scales in both domestic and transnational contexts, as well as critically self-reflect on my own position within them. Sitting with these inquiries the first time, the gift of Davy's instruction was in his response to my thinking around them. I'm deeply grateful for the space of trial and, indeed, error that came from interrogating what I thought I knew, feeling out the ideas I was playing with, and the thoughts I was beginning to tease. And particularly the encouragement of modes of inquiry which might have been new, might not have been totally comfortable, but became, for me, a foundational primer in what it means to study gender and sexuality, which continually influences my approach to teaching and study. I often encountered difficulty when trying to describe my own work. To articulate it beyond the corrective of no, to work in trans studies is not necessarily to be an ethnographer of trans people. I often find myself explaining what I don't do rather than what I'm actually interested in and what I understand working in trans studies to make possible. The thinking I'm about to sort of attempt to articulate is very much inflected from several extraordinary teachers that I've had the opportunity of having during the course of my academic career, who I won't name for the sake of time, but it's important to me that you all know that they are very much there. So to me, working in trans studies means to engage trans study. That is a methodology guided by an ethic as much as a concrete process, a mode of inquiry that is always curious and questioning, one that is not inherently standardized with a unilaterally applicable approach, but rather respondent to the needs of its objects, archive, figures, context, and geography, and is always deeply attendant to race, power, and class. I've started to wonder if I can get away with describing my relationship to trans study as a kind of T for T relationality, which is a frame I'm borrowing from Cameron Awkward-Rich and Hill Malatino's introduction to TSQ's The T for T issue, which came out in 2019, I think. Their introduction, Meanwhile, T for T, which is where I got my title, offers T for T as an open question, as vernacular, as a practice of, quote, love, desire, connection, and support that is simultaneously imperative and deeply difficult to cultivate and maintain, something that is fraught, imperfect, and ongoing, end quote. In this framing, T for T is an approach that asks trans studies what it is and does and might do, simultaneously sustaining and insufficient, and, quote, a site of seductive ease and of profound trouble, end quote. Following Tori Peters, Awkward-Rich and Malatino suppose T for T as a concept for the meanwhile that might sometimes provide places of rest, generative conflict, a bit of pleasure, scenes to run away from with a better sense of why we are running. This is in many ways my approach to study. This T for T practice of love that is always a little fraught, but still deeply and compellingly seductive. amid a meanwhile that is an intermediate, indeterminable space in which so much might become possible if you're willing to sit between assurances. In my current departmental home of American Studies at Brown, grad students identify key terms that animate our research interest. Among mine are trans studies, environmental humanities and eco-criticism, affect, aesthetics, and visual culture, madness, and queer of color critique. The disciplinary eccentrics that are my department and also my closest friends and colleagues delight in describing our feral approach to disciplinarity, thinking there with Mel Chen, a scavenger endeavor of crafting archives of overlooked objects, and I like to describe my approach as promiscuous because, sexuality studies. Right now, I am sitting with a performance artist who shoveled sand for 14 hours and thinking about labor, affect, and whiteness. I'm sitting with a Brazilian educator, activist, and performer and thinking about human and non-human relations beyond anthropocentric paradigms. I'm sitting with the sesame plant, its role in global agriculture, capital, and commerce, and how ugly sesames become oil and wind their way into healthcare. I continue to think about the collection of poetry, Sympathetic Little Monster, which I wrote about first in Davy's class, in an essay with a title so wildly unspecific and ardently opinionated that I will never repeat it. And I'm always sitting with the diaries of Lou Sullivan and the way he described not so great feelings as stormy because language was otherwise insufficient. Now, these might become dissertation chapters or essays, or they might just nebulously float around in my head for a while as I come to an understanding of my own thoughts. I am very much in the meanwhile of graduate study. The sitting space to grapple with difficulty, daily discovery and frustration and revelation and heartbreak and caring ferociously. In my time at Penn, I learned a great deal about what a classroom could look like and what fulsomely bringing yourself makes possible. And I learned so much of that from the graduate students who I got to have as my teachers. In GSWS, these were Shoshana Adler, Rovel Sakura, Joshua Coleman, Ava Kim, who will be here tomorrow, plug, and Davy Knittle. And I thank you for showing me how I might make the most of the meanwhile. Thank you.
It's me. All right. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, to be back in this community after a few years away, and so exciting to hear what all of my fellow panelists are working on. It's great to be in an interdisciplinary space and just get to look into other people's brains. So thank you all for that. So I see that the name of this panel has landed up being Next Generation, which is a quite sort of menacing title to me for reasons I can't quite identify. But at some point, it was New Directions in Gender and Sexuality Studies, and I hope you will forgive me for having taken that as the structuring conceit of what I'm about to say, because that title intimidated me as well. The idea of what a new direction would be for gender and sexuality studies, and perhaps most menacingly of all, how I could see myself as someone who had something to say about that question. So I'm going to try, and I'm going to address what I saw as the kind of provocation of new directions in gender and sexuality studies from the perspective which seemed most relevant for my own work, which is how gender and sexuality studies can help us think about the study of violence, which is what I generally study. So at least how it helps me teach and research about violence. Towards that end, there are 2 points that I kind of wanted to talk about, which are both specifically about what I understand as the relationship between feminist theory writ large and this practice, right, of studying violence. And the first was the one that I intended to talk about, and as I wrote this, I increasingly ended up talking about the second, so I'll try and reinstate some balance here. But the first is about the kind of tools and methodologies of the discipline and the ways in which we work with them. I think probably I do not have to make the case to this audience that violence is a feminist question, by which I mean that feminist perspectives can and do help us identify the questions that we can and need to ask about experiences of violence and about engagement with it. More specifically, in my own work, strands of feminist theory offer me some particular tools for answering these questions. So I like to think about the sort of phenomenology of feminism and the way in which it highlights the interdependence between bodies and context as one way of asking questions about forms of violence that often seem impossible or illegible, or as we see them described so often over and over again as meaningless or senseless. So in my own work, I especially rely on feminist phenomenology to study the materiality of violence, so the ways in which forms of violence are materially specific and the ways in which that material specificity becomes politically consequential. The idea being that forms of violence are never random, that they are never chosen for instrumental utility alone, but that generally they do tell us something about the projects for which they are mobilized. Feminism's emphasis on relationality, on the ways in which we are constituted intersubjectively, and the ways in which that our politics are vested in and worked out on and through bodies, I think gives us some entry points for starting to ask those questions. It also helps us contend with the meaning and substance of those qualitatively different forms of violence. And more broadly, perhaps, I find that feminist theory in my own work helps me remember that subjects and their actions are never unencumbered, and that we do not need to rely on a concept of pure and agentic exercises of power as the only place where politics can happen. Now, when I was originally planning what I was going to say today, it was going to be a lot on that theme, and I was going to talk about some examples from kind of my own work about how I have tried, and hopefully sometimes even succeeded, in using feminist phenomenology to open up different ways of thinking about forms of violence. But as I was thinking of this question of new directions, and in particular about the ways in which the field has honestly and most pressingly impacted my own work, I was pulled in a different direction. I warned you it was going to be an organizing conceit. But this does bring me to my second point, which is maybe more serious, which is perhaps why I'm making so many jokes about it, which is about the ways in which I think feminist theory enables us, or at least enables me, to do the kind of work that is necessary in a moment in which we are often oversaturated with violence. And by that, I mean that it offers us some ways of thinking systematically and rigorously about what it means to study violence and how the production of knowledge both potentially implicates us in and also exposes us to harm. So as someone who kind of is constantly immersed in archives of violence, I think it's important to think about the ways in which feminist theory calls on us to reconsider the dynamics of knowledge production and reminds us that knowledge production itself is always relational. That has any number of consequences, but the one that I perhaps take reassurance from that I do this work is that it reminds us that we are never doing the work alone. Of course, spaces like this are evidence of that, but the other piece of evidence that I take from the kind of feminist phenomenological approach in particular is paradoxically the idea that if I am here doing the work, that means that there is a community that exists, right? Because that I who is working, the I who is thinking, the I who is analyzing is always being contingently constructed by the other people and places and contexts and objects and spaces that make up that thing that I see as the I. In some ways, this is a very unnerving theory to apply to yourself. I think particularly for those of us in the world of academia where there is such a strong mandate to think in terms of the I, right? That it's my work, that it's my project, that it's my research, that you must claim kind of authorship and ownership over the knowledge that you produce in order for it to be meaningful. But for those of us, and I think this is true of most people who work in gender and sexuality studies, our intellectual commitments often demand that we stay engaged with work that is difficult and that we sort of toil in that, right? That we stay with the trouble, if I can borrow a phrase. I think it is therefore important to also recognize the ways in which those same intellectual commitments might offer us some avenues for pushing back against that darkness, or at least for rendering it as manageable. So, to return to my lighthearted conceit after all of that, on the idea of new directions in gender and sexuality studies, I think part of what the field offers us is not only new directions in the sense of avenues for exploration, but also new directions in the sense of alternative ways of orienting ourselves towards the work. I think the latter is just as important as the former, and maybe right now, even more important, at least to me. Thanks.
So I have 3 print access copies of my talk. Would anyone find it helpful to have them? And Gwendolyn or Melissa, can I give them to you? Oh, I think I might have 4. Great, thank you. And so my sustained introduction to the study of gender and sexuality was in Melissa Sanchez's spring 2016 graduate course, Early Modern Sexualities. The final paper I wrote in Early Modern Sexualities now sounds to me exactly like something a first-year English doctoral student might have written in 2016. It was entitled, "And Thou in This Shall Find Thy Monument, the Queer Futurity of Shakespeare's Sonnets." You can laugh, it's okay. In her marginal comments, Melissa wrote, in response to a sentence about the iterable futurity that poems have when read aloud, quote, "I'd love to hear you theorize the relationship between this singular futurity and the collective futurity that builds up over time. It seems to challenge the individual intention, agency that Edelman assumes." This comment introduced me to the idea that there is a tension in queer studies between the singular and the collective, and between individual and structural scales. But what amazed me about this comment when I read it in May of 2016 was the idea that a seminar paper wasn't the end of a conversation. A faculty member had told me that she believed I had more to say on the topic, and that she was interested in listening. I learned by reading these comments and by being in Melissa's class that a gift we can offer to students is to invite them into a sustained conversation about the course material, to engage them not only as people learning a critical conversation, but also as meaningful contributors to it. I had the privilege as a dissertating graduate student to work with many other people who did the institution building work to give me and many other graduate students opportunities to take part in a precious corner of institutional life governed by the care ethics, critical questions, and methodology of feminist, queer, and trans studies. Gwendolyn Beetham found financial support for Ava, Kim, and me to co-teach a spring 2020 undergraduate seminar on trans method. Trans method, in I think a different form, continues to be offered at Penn. Nat Rifkin is teaching it this semester, and Beans Velocci has taught it in the past. Both Ava and I continue to teach it in our respective current institutions. Gwendolyn also generously spent dozens of hours with me in her office in 2018 and 2019 when I was the GSWS graduate associate and full of questions about how institutions work and how to support my students as I began teaching GSWS courses. I was trained as a graduate student at Penn to think about gender studies as the analysis of how structures of power operate. In his 2019 monograph, Going Stealth, Transgender Politics and U.S. Surveillance Practices, one of those books that came out right when I was writing my dissertation, and so I will never be able to get away from it. In my mind, it just is perfect. And I've learned that everyone kind of has these books that just as you were starting to understand how a field worked, a book came out that made that field transparent to you, and you just love it forever. It's like a teddy bear. I teach it constantly. This is Toby Beecham's book. Beecham explains his system-scale approach to trans studies by noting that, quote, bodies, identities, and behaviors may be read as gender deviant in relation to a perceived or actual racial identity, religious affiliation, nationality and citizenship status, class status, disability, or sexuality. Beecham echoes decades of feminist, queer, and trans studies scholars who emphasize that the study of gender and/or sexuality and the study of unevenly situated racialized power are part of a shared critical project. His argument in Going Stealth that surveillance produces transgender as a category extends quite a bit of earlier work. For instance, Hortense Spillers argues famously in 1987 that in what she refers to as the, quote, historical outline of dominance, centuries of various manifestations of anti-Black social and political structures in the U.S., quote, we lose at least gender difference in the outcome, and the female body and the male body become a territory of cultural and political maneuver, not at all gender-related, gender-specific. So the work that brings together feminist theory and trans theory is to figure out how this happens, how gender is contextually produced variously and iterably. And the work of a queer study is undertaken from the perspective of trans and feminist critique is to figure out how, quote, cultural and political maneuver produces sexuality as inextricable from racialized gender. My own scholarly practice focuses on the intersection of queer and trans studies, urban studies, and the environmental humanities. The questions that are of interest to me are those like, how has mid-20th century urban and environmental change in U.S. cities shaped queer and trans theory and cultural production? How can queer and trans theoretical approaches to thinking about nonlinear futures elucidate how white cis heteronormativity often undergirds discourses of energy transition? How can questions about multi-species justice contribute to queer and trans critiques of the human as a category used to justify the dispossession of marginalized people? As a doctoral student at Penn, I learned from courses in feminist and queer theory, from opportunities to teach in GSWS, and from GSWS programming how to participate in and carefully listen to scholarly conversations across gender and sexuality studies. But I also learned how to bend the resources of the institution towards students who are often underserved by it. And I learned this by benefiting from having those resources bent for me so that I could research and teach in the ways that I found compelling. I learned to be generous with my time and emotional energy as I taught students who sought me out as a mentor. I also learned to be critical of the ways that this emotional labor is unevenly distributed, and to be always trying to balance students' needs for mentorship with my own capacity. Work in gender and sexuality studies at Penn, as at many institutions, is fueled by the labor of a small group of faculty, staff, and students working very hard to keep these conversations going as the financial and political conditions of the university try to make them impossible. Melissa, Gwendolyn, Maria Murphy, and many other people did a lot of labor to make it possible for me to have a sense of purpose and belonging as a graduate student. I'm grateful for their labor and to be able to support students in my home institution now because of the opportunities they worked with and against the university to make for me and for many, many others. Thanks.
Hi. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, hi. Hello, I'm Alicia Meyer. I am a curator here at the Kislak Center, so you all have come to my job today. But I'm of this community, so it feels a little bit like your family coming to work to check on your new job. So hello and welcome. I graduated from this program in the Department of English in 2022. And in my new role as a curator, I'm working with archives here in the Kislak Center to help Penn students learn more about whatever topics it is that they're interested in and the role of those topics in institutions like Penn's. And I say that because I want to invite you all to the exhibit going on right over there in the Lee Library that features the archives of the founding of this program. So there are many more documents that maybe you can help us learn more about on display that help sort of echo Melissa's wonderful introduction to this symposium. I cannot possibly take credit for imagining what new directions in gender and sexuality studies might be. But I think for me, thinking about new directions is always about looking back on old directions and reassessing what the old things were. And so today I thought maybe I would share with you a little case study from some of the research that I've been doing since completing my dissertation, which was on the icon of the prostitute in Renaissance literature. So I think about the prostitute not so much in a historical context, but what sorts of political ideas are filtered through this iconic representation. And today I'm going to focus on one particular case in which the icon of the Renaissance prostitute was activated as a site of sexual learning for Havelock Ellis in the 19th century and his coterie of authors and historians. So under Ellis, the symbol of the siren and the prostitute and the sex worker represented an edited collection of books. It was like the logo on the books. For a series that Ellis called the New Mermaid series, the best plays of the old dramatists. This series would be the forerunner to a series of early modern and modern plays still produced today. So maybe some of you have seen them. Has anyone ever used a New Mermaid's book in maybe their teaching or their research? Oh, there they are. Hello, yes, so you know. So this series is still in production today. It is co-edited by early modern scholars Tiffany Stern and William Carroll. And like the Arden series or the Norton Critical Editions, The New Mermaids is a series of edited early modern plays for students, scholars, and anyone interested in studying or performing early modern drama, but its origins lie with Ellis. In 1884, while Ellis was studying medicine at St. Thomas Hospital in London, he made regular trips to the British Museum to read non-Shakespearean Renaissance literature. Turns out he was like a huge fan. At the time, you could easily purchase texts by Shakespeare or by Christopher Marlowe, but works by some of the more niche Renaissance authors were only available at the library. In his autobiography, Ellis writes of his frustration with the museum, which he saw as both inconvenient and a form of surveillance. The museum was overly watchful of his reading, distrustful of his motives, and censored his book access. He writes in the autobiography, "On my way to and from the school at Mitcham, I often used to buy one or two of the extensive series of old plays, then being published in a small type of penny each. Marlowe, as well as, of course, Shakespeare, I had long possessed and loved. Of late, I had been reading the other great Elizabethan dramatists in the British Museum, especially Ford, which is John Ford. But it was an inconvenient way of reading them. It seemed to me that the best of these plays ought to be more generally accessible in such a way that the finest of all these, I also missed my spot. The finest of all were not omitted for the sake of some absurd prudery. I could not, for instance, have tolerated an edition of Ford from which was excluded the master's chief play, 'Tis Pity She's a Whore. I would have a sound and true edition of these great Elizabethans, or none at all." From this statement, we can see that Ellis was not only frustrated with the museum, but also with a wave of moral censorship actively threatening the publishing industry. Ellis's autobiography was written decades away from the actual creation of the Mermaid series, so what happened next in its creation and temporary downfall may have corrupted his memory. But as far as he could remember, he set about creating the Mermaid series with two major collaborators. The first was his co-editor, historian John Addington Symonds. Symonds's historiography centered and celebrated queer men in the Renaissance and accessed that history to offer a queer, if primarily bourgeois white man, vision and collective identity that allied that identity with Victorian society and culture. In the words of Will Fisher, Symonds's historiography argued that the newly emergent notion of the homosexual not only had a history, but had a history that made valuable contributions to society and the cultural development of the West more generally. Symonds's historiography was also designed to offer a community. The second major collaborator was the publisher Henry Vizetelly, whom Ellis met through Eleanor Marx Aveling, whose English translation of Madame Bovary Vizetelly also published. And he was also actively publishing Zola's novels at the time in translation, and so this comes into play for the Mermaid series. Under Ellis and Symonds, Vizetelly published 20 editions of collected early modern plays. Most notably, Symonds edited a collection of works by Christopher Marlowe, and Ellis edited the works of John Ford. And when Ellis edits Ford, he writes more of a hagiography than a critical account. He praises the playwright as, quote, the most sensitive observer who had meditated deeply on the springs of human action, especially in women. But that he writes of women not as a dramatist nor as a lover, but as one who had searched intimately and felt instinctive sympathy the fibers of their hearts, making him an analyst rather than a playwright. And in his sparse notes and framing of all 20 texts, the Mermaid series remains consistently interested in the status and sexuality of marginalized and sexualized women characters. For his part, Ellis was particularly interested in the role of words like whore and the plays like Tis Pity She's a Whore. And I can't tell you how surprised I was that we had so much in common. What a shock, right? All of these books were produced under the iconic siren of, the iconic image of the siren or the mermaid. And in the Renaissance, the mermaid was a figure that represented knowledge. But by the time of Ellis's work in the Mermaid series, mermaids were increasingly used to signify colonized subjects. The particular mermaid that adorns the Mermaid series books is a figure holding a mirror up to her face, making her both a mermaid and a symbolic representation of vanity. the great irony of the vanity personification is that we, the viewer, are invited to condemn the shallowness of women, and especially women who are looking at themselves, while we are also looking at her for our own pleasure. In Shakespeare's time, vanity was an eroticized image whom we are meant to condemn. And I have several examples of this that I wasn't able to show you today, but I'd love to show you some other time. So looking at these books and other books that were in circulation at that time have brought me to a place where I am asking how this history of the production of the book affected not just the production of sexology or of the feminist movement, but of the field of literary studies, because Shakespeare scholarship had a tremendous influence on how the field developed in the 20th century. And given this deep history of Ellis's involvement in key texts and the availability of those texts, not only for scholars, but for students, I think that there's something there to think more with. The last anecdote that I'll leave you with today is that these books, these Renaissance plays that most people find extremely boring, were suppressed as pornography and moved into a subscription-only service. And they were circulated and sold with other pornographic texts. And so there's more to come on this in my new directions in gender studies, but that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Okay, so I appreciate that all of us have done entirely different things. So this is another iteration, which for me, I decided to approach this as a bit of, a case study as one of the, newer members of the GSWS faculty, myself as a kind of microcosm of the knowledge production that is going on here, or, what is happening in the present and what might I continue to do as a person situated here. So it's a bit of an overview of just kind of what I've been working on, but then also some reflections on what Melissa referred to before as professional transness, being professionally trans, as well as some thoughts on just kind of very broad, where are things going field-wise. So the main thing that I'm doing right now and what has kind of occupied most of my time since I got here at Penn in 2021, I think. Is that right? That sounds right. Right, so I'm working on a book that is titled Binary Logic, The Power of Incoherence in American Sex Science, which is now under contract officially with Duke. Thank you. And the overarching argument of this book is that sex works as a classification system in large part because it doesn't make any sense. There is, as the title says, a lot of power in incoherence. And I came to this through a sort of unlikely ally or accomplice, someone who we do not usually think of as part of, the gender studies canon, who's Thomas Kuhn. If you are, perhaps not as half in the world of history of science as I am, he is the structure of scientific revolutions guy, and makes the point that one of the ways that scientific paradigms changes is that there are all of these anomalies that kind of crop up, and scientists can't account for them, and then there's this crisis, and they're like, well, I guess we need a new theory, and someone comes up with a new theory, right? That is the very small cliff notes. The structure of scientific revolutions. Don't tell history and sociology of science, my other department, that is how I characterized it. But so as I was first reading Kuhn and rereading Kuhn as someone who was kind of being trained in history of science as well as gender and sexuality and trans studies, it became very apparent to me that this was not how the history of sex science had worked. There were a lot of anomalies. There had been anomalies over and over for a very, very long time. There was far more evidence that sex was not binary than evidence that it was binary. And yet, here we were, a solid 200 years into the period of time that I was studying, with a scientifically backed system of binary sex. So the book is basically how and why that happened. And it's also a methodological argument about trans history as a method rather than just a subject. So the vast majority of the book, though I frame it as trans history, does not look at trans people. It looks at all of the people who are usually assumed to be cis, who were in fact not kicked out of binary categories of male and female in the 19th and 20th century US. It is essentially, as I'm framing it, a prehistory of cisness to make the argument that a lot of work goes into making it seem like most people just happen to fit the male and female categories that they are sorted into. A lot of stuff has to be ignored and forgotten and rendered exceptional rather than using that to rethink an entire system of sex. And I do that through, and I'm happy if people want to hear more about this to talk about the kind of individual chapters of the book, but I look at this kind of network of knowledge producers going from mid-19th century zoology through eugenics, gynecology, statistical studies of sex, mostly Kinsey, and through early trans medicine, and essentially look at all of the ways that the sorting of bodies and people is entirely inconsistent. So that's what most of my time is being spent on. But one of the other things that I'm doing, and this is where I get a little bit into the kind of being professionally non-binary thing, is that in addition to my work as a historian and as a trans studies person, I'm also trying very hard to convince scientists that the stuff that we do over here is important. Mm-hmm. And so to that end, I've been doing a bunch of work trying to kind of translate queer and feminist STS specifically, but also just kind of trans studies more broadly into scientific practice, right? To try to get scientists to think about how to do their research in ways that don't reinforce the idea that, in this oversimplified way, gender equals social and sex equals biological, and that therefore they can just like keep doing sex stuff without questioning all of the categories because they're, working on, salmon. As just one real example. So that has involved doing things like co-editing a special section of The American Naturalist, which is an ecology and evolutionary biology journal. I have an article coming out in Cell in just a couple of weeks. I'm currently co-writing a piece. Actually, we literally just finished it yesterday. So I guess I was up until yesterday co-writing a piece with Shana Stites, who is in the psychiatry department here, about sex and gender orientation, sexual orientation and gender identity data. Thank you. Data collection in Alzheimer's and dementia research, right? So this is all just very kind of broadly scattered about. None of this is my real job, it turns out. Apparently I'm supposed to do history stuff. But I'm doing that anyway, right? Because part of, I think, the challenge of doing this kind of work is making it feel useful and not like we're either screaming into a void or just like yelling at each other in rooms like this, which is, of course, very validating, but often can feel, especially as a historian who mostly, is going through dead people's mail, kind of difficult to feel like that is doing anything to, help the present be less shitty for trans people, which is a thing I would really, like it to be less shitty. I was going to talk about my kind of upcoming new project that I'm about to start, and just for the sake of time, I will just very, very briefly say that I am starting a new project now that the first book is almost done. Very, very tentatively titled This Will Change, Repopulate, a queer history of a straight future, that looks at post-disaster repopulation narratives in the 20th century, to think about how these tropes of repopulation cross between science and sci-fi and rebiologize maleness and femaleness as this kind of, when the shit hits the fan, no one will care about identity. It will just be, the biological task to, reproduce humanity. It's a trope that is everywhere, and it seems to be doing a lot of cultural work that I think is perhaps worth spending some time on. which brings me to the kind of being professionally trans bit of things, which I think is crucial for kind of understanding the forms of knowledge production that it is possible to do in a university space. So in addition to my academic work that I've talked about, in addition to my sort of outreach to scientists stuff, I am also constantly yelling about trying to get a better gender-neutral bathroom in Cohen Hall, because currently my office is on the 3rd floor and I have to go to the basement, to the corner of the basement to pee. And that's annoying. And I think probably we can do better than that as part of a larger attempt to get better bathroom access on this campus. Bathrooms are such a boring topic, and yet one that I have to contend with multiple times a day. So I would rather just get that over with so that I can stop thinking about it. The other thing that is going on right now, which fingers crossed seems to be going well, but an update, is improving the faculty insurance coverage for gender-affirming care. I found at this point several months ago that my own attempts to get something covered were going to be impossible, because it turned out that even though the WPATH standards of care are a very, very low bar, the Penn faculty insurance plan did not even reach that bar. So I've been working with HR, and HR has been working with Independence Blue Cross. And it seems like things are now better, and we have gone beyond the WPATH standards of care for faculty gender-affirming care coverage. So that is also, not technically my job, and yet something that I seem to spend a lot of time on. And I'll just conclude by saying, a kind of fifth little piece of thing that's not really attached to anything in particular, but I guess my hope for the future of gender studies, or new directions, or new things to generate newly. I've been thinking a lot about how it feels like we've gotten to a point where, at least as I see it, we can no longer do gender studies, trans studies, feminist studies as if sex and gender just exist. We often talk about how we know that our categories in the present are no more stable than, a model like sexual inversion, for example. But we don't always act like it. And so I've been really curious, and I would love to talk more with all of you about how to kind of maintain a commitment to queer and trans and feminist politics while also working towards the obsolescence of the categories that make it very hard to live in the world as a person in those categories. And for me, that is specifically while working towards the obsolescence of cisness. So that's what's happening here at GSWS from me. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. This is such a great panel, and I hope you still have some room to listen to one more person at the end of it. Do you hear me? Okay. Nancy, do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay. All right. Okay. Then I'll basically kiss the microphone. My name is Seçil Yilmaz, and I'm a historian and a core faculty in the GSWS. And I'm coming from my work, and I myself am coming from a completely different part of the world vis-a-vis this panel. And I basically work on the history of sexuality, gender, and medicine in the late Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. And I teach courses on modern Middle East broadly at Penn at the moment in relation to history of science, sexuality, but also the broader survey of modern Middle East. And I invite you to imagine what it might mean in these days to handle these tasks as everything has been unfolding in the place that we call Middle East here, and I call home in my own context. I'm currently also working on my first book project, which is tentatively titled Biopolitical Empire, Syphilis, Medicine, and Sex in the Late Ottoman World. And here in this context, I explore and I argue that the formation of modern empire through the study of syphilis to make the argument that late Ottoman Empire expanded and solidified their imperial hegemony and governance by situating medicine and sex at the center of the imperial rule. Syphilis takes the center stage in my narrative, and I often receive the question of, how did you come to this topic? But happy to address this in the Q&A. And my overarching question is actually based on a particular question that I came across in the archives, which is an Ottoman Greek physician who happened to be the chief physician of the empire. In the midst of an cholera epidemic in 1865, decided to send a letter to all the provincial administrators to ask, do you have any syphilitics in your province, and how do you treat them? What kind of health facilities and what kind of treatment methods that you have? Which was basically the very first time, even though syphilis has existed in the Ottoman context since the 16th century, the very emergence of the concept itself. For the first time, actually, an Ottoman administrator acknowledged it, and going off the making of categories here. For the first time, the disease itself has been considered, quote unquote, a public health matter. So this is my cue, and this is how I basically start my project. And the book's narrative is like, what happened in the late Ottoman Empire? What happened in the world of Marco Pasha, and what happened in the world of all these like very high elite bureaucrats in the late Ottoman Empire, that all of a sudden this particular disease that had like many different words that corresponded in the folk medicine, in the Arabo-Persian vocabularies, that for the first time it was considered a big threat, a social and political panic. And if going off the publishing a book and editors, I will try to convince the prospective editor that I argue that Ottoman Empire collapsed because of syphilis. So basically, so actually there are some precursors in this context, like basically several reasons for syphilis or any epidemic disease, as a matter of fact, to become prevalent in the historical context, such as increased mobility of soldiers, Muslim immigrants, and seasonal workers traveling about the Ottoman countryside could be reasons. However, even such extensive population movement doesn't really help us to explain why the disease became such a source of political panic at this time. To the degree that Ottoman officials basically dispatched medical staff all the way to the rural areas. And I don't know if you can imagine the map of the modern Middle East today, but that's basically what the Ottoman territory was pretty much in the 19th century. It's a lot of medical labor power that the Ottomans really didn't have to contain syphilis, right? It's not cholera that kills, but so we're basically talking about it. Somehow like it was a minor issue for a very long time. They basically established hospitals and clinics specifically to treat syphilis, and then they implemented really strict regulations of men and of women alike. But there is a little bit of switch here that as opposed to European context where prostitutes were at the center of the moralizing practices, actually Ottomans basically give a domestic passport to men to carry around to show that they are actually free of syphilis. So we're basically looking at disciplining men's bodies and men's sexualities vis-a-vis syphilis being at the center. So in this particular context, in my research and in the political agenda, I try to situate the Ottoman Empire and the global South within the transnational history of empire and sexuality studies. So Ottoman Empire had been long marginalized as the sick man of Europe, and a notion that became popular in the 19th century, alluding to empire's weakness. Therefore, it neither fits into the narratives of empire nor colonizer like their European counterparts, and Ottomans were often defined as a semi-colonial context by the world system theorists. The dominant narrative rooted in the Eastern question suggests that Ottomans imported and mimicked Western-inspired modernization practices, such as reform in the army, medicine, installment of industries, and eventually none of these reforms were orchestrated by the locals due to the political instability, chaos, inadequacy of the imperial power and rather they're often implanted by the Europeans as the inherent carriers of civilization, modernity, rationality, and of course imperialism. So in my own work, I attempt to challenge this portrayal, and I argue that Ottoman medical knowledge and practices framed around the question of syphilis served as an effective and vital tool through which the Ottomans actually governed and disciplined their own population by cultivating specific ideas and practices of health and sexuality in the minds and bodies of the citizens. So contrary to tropes in the recent scholarship portraying conversations about sex and sexuality in the late Ottoman context, and please read it as in the Muslim context, as silenced and erased, I would like to offer a different reading and a different archive and demonstrate that marriage and family hygiene was where the public conversations about sexuality and sex talk took place in the late Ottoman context. And in this context, I'm not only talking about heterosexuality, but actually marriage and family hygiene contains all sorts of conversations about same-sex desire, homosexuality, and the kind of like vocabularies that has been inhibited in there. So similarly, histories of medicine and sexuality shared a methodological origin and mentality that reduced them to symptoms of modernization and westernization attempts, and attributed a sharp break between the modern and pre-modern context that kind of like Foucault unfortunately inflict us, and it's still taking us like 40 years now, over 40 years trying to overcome that sharp break. So instead, I actually propose, and I kind of like evidence that the Ottoman physicians and intellectuals creatively bridge older forms of vocabularies, and here I basically refer to Ottoman, Arabo-Persian medical repertoire, basically that they drove since from like 13th century well into the 19th century. So we're talking about a really large archive, and mostly through by tracing bahnames, which are sort of like Kama Sutra, like sex manuals. They bring the vocabularies and the categories that are kind of like embedded in them, and they basically pack them with newer forms of knowledge and political objectives attached to them. They did selectively translate and compile a substantial and contemporary body of literature from primarily French and German bestsellers. And finally, I explore a historical context spanning from 1880s into 1914 to show how the dissemination of knowledge and practices about family hygiene and sexual health was regarded critical in the formation of self-governing, rational, and moral individuals. So writing about sexual desire became subsumed by a medical and scientific epistemology and vocabulary, which shielded the subject of sex from associations with the obscene to make it to be talked in publicly in the newspapers and so forth. To maintain effective social control over intimacy and reproduction, Ottoman physicians formulated modern and medical knowledge about marriage, proper sexual conduct, and law. So in my research, I contribute and offer interventions to transnational and interdisciplinary studies of medicine, sexuality, and colonialism by centering the Ottomans' experience within the syphilis outbreak in the second half of the 19th century. And therefore, I methodologically engage with the ever-growing field of histories of medicine, sex, and biopolitics with a critical approach to Euro-American centric canon dominating the field in on itself. So the question of agency, especially considering the Foucauldian tropes and the totalism in terms of like the structural approaches to the study of this particular topic as problematic, this question of agency is very central to my work. I'm a social historian by training. I consider myself as a storyteller. So therefore, I perceive political and social encounters, confrontations and negotiations among diverse agents in that power and hegemony are formed and nested. So there's a particular kind of like emphasis I try to bring in one page. A global, a national, and local historical element speaks to each other. And then there we see all sorts of unpredictabilities, but also all sorts of inconsistencies in that particular context. So I do that by unearthing the changing dynamics pertaining to the authority of medicine as a source of social and political reformer, and the increasing role of physician in the formation of this particular social reform, and the centrality of the values attributed to sex, gender, and sexuality as the major factors, and which basically led to formation of a modern empire right before its demise. So in a very provocative fashion, which I basically gave away in the beginning, but not, I would like to reiterate, it was syphilis that basically led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Thank you so much for your patience.
I'm told that one of our speakers for the next panel was unable to make it, so we can take an extra 5-10 minutes if anyone has questions for this panel.
Which is parallel in Western homosexuality. Well, essential certain hands policing warriors.
Heavy duty.
And the question is to both of us, or obviously?
Thinking.
Right. So I think the what is in this picture in this study of syphilis, so the value of it is like the intervention is rather to whether the ideas traveled from east to west or west to east, they are simultaneity and spontaneity at the same time, that all these characters, I mean, I work with the physicians, right? Like the late Ottoman physicians who had been on the move between Constantinople, Istanbul, and France, Paris, and Germany. Less so, they have entanglements with the British, so I cannot speak to that. But they're basically this whole like diplomatic setup that they are within, that they basically go study and bring back that part of the kind of like knowledge, the brand new science that engage with Pasteur and whatnot back into the Constantinople, right? But in the meantime, there are German and French physicians who are basically, because it's so difficult to compete with their counterparts unless they kind of latch onto a colonial context, they are constantly commissioned to come and work in the Ottoman Empire. So the kind of like ideas, the ways in which like the idea of policing start working is like when these figures are actually in the same space and they kind of like start throwing each other their Occidentalist on Orientalist views. So we are basically talking about and making of a transnational understanding of and the workings of sexuality and science and medicine in this particular context, in which there is no unidirectionality, at least from the work that I'm doing. But basically, we are looking at how they're kind of like mutually constituted. I don't know if I'm able to.
Much West mobilize.
Right.
Eventually trying to add territories. We see Orientalism.
Right.
Hold on.
Mm-hmm.
Interest.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The whole idea of like the sexuality of the Muslim societies being different, perverse, informed by Islamic practices, and we see this in the Krafft-Ebing's writings, like how polygamy and polygamic societies being deviant and so on and so forth. We are definitely like seeing that in the kind of like writings, but considering that Krafft-Ebing had never actually made it to the Ottoman context, right? What I'm looking at is like rather than taking that and taking it as unilateral narrative or discursive practice and try to explain the kind of reform or transformation or shifts taking place in the Ottoman Empire by looking at that like completely unattached narrative. I basically go back to the policies and politics that Ottomans and the narratives of the Ottoman bureaucrats are producing and looking at what basically urged them. And what we're looking at in this particular context, Ottoman's self-understanding of that they're actually a modern empire, that they're as modern as French, they're as modern as the British, they're as colonial, they're as imperial as their counterparts. So they're basically not copying anything really, but they're basically trying to create the kind of like moral subject in the form of, as it's informed by what we call in this context the Western medicine, right? And also in the context of their own imperial needs, to be able to kind of like claim their own imperial power. And up until like really 1908 or 1910s, that works out to the degree that Armenian genocide takes its own course, as obviously they are already like a Darwinist at many levels. And the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is kind of like the evidence that that type of like creating that nationalist eugenic moral subject has been completed. So basically, I basically argued it's within, but engage with the global context.
Thank you all. This is just such a very cool. So many questions for all of you. Maybe I'll just have one of Alicia. Thank you so much. I really love that kind of work that we're doing, kind of for a work history. Alice, a little bit. I heard you say that the mermaid was a kind of a symbol of the colonized.
You did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about that? Do you see like Alice collaborators be that process of continued colonization, or like this is very treasure that the forward plays themselves, or there's a identification with the colonized, or I just have a
Totally.
more like, or is there some kind of more complex to play? Just wondering about like how you saw the kind of like imperial politics of that kind of mark kind of editorial practice of the play.
I also wonder what I think about this. This is like the $1 million question, right? Because I in taking up the Renaissance prostitute, and I think misreading the Renaissance prostitute, but doing something kind of like weird and interesting and almost Freudian with it, Ellis and Simmons and their buds also are taking up the racial politics of Renaissance plays, which have a very different relationship to colonial power. It's not that they don't have a relationship to colonial power, but it's different than the height of the British Empire that is allowing sexology to emerge as a global enterprise, right? A transnational enterprise. And so I believe Simmons's work has been noted for its sort of production of whiteness, which is not necessarily the same as colonial. But I would say that in my reading of their notes and their brief introductions, they seem less critical or interested in race and national identity than they do gender and sexuality. So now we would read those as, co-constitutive, right? Like they need each other. They can't exist without one another. But for whatever reason, I mean, we can imagine the reasons, but Ellis does not interrogate those moments. Instead, kind of aligns with them. So in erotic scenes of like oh, the fabulous Adonis body, this white alabaster body, it's so hot, right? Like Ellis and Simmons and everyone is right there with that erotic charge. And that's what they love about these texts, right? They're not interrogating it in the same way that they are so excited and keen to interrogate the gender politics, especially the politics of women, which surprised me. It made me go back and look at Simmons's work and realize how much he writes about courtesans and prostitutes in Renaissance Italy. And so I hope that starts to answer your question, but it's one that I'm thinking about too.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
History and thank you so much. My name is Hardeep. I'm a new faculty member in the Department of History, and I'll ask a question, and it's really a question of empire for Seçil and for Beans, and I'll kind of phrase it in two different ways because I think it applies to your work in distinct ways, and Beans really your second project. But Seçil, can I ask you to talk a little more about the way in which sexuality and masculinity plays out in the Ottoman Empire in relationship to different kinds of identities, right? Tribal or customary in various ways. I'm thinking about the kind of work it does there. And then Beans, I really want to know more about your second project. And I know you probably don't want to talk about it because you're probably still working through it in many ways and it's the early stages. But I'm also thinking about the way in which disaster happens and there's not a call for reproduction. And this often happens in imperial spaces or in places where there's a population that you don't want, right? I'm thinking about in the early 20th century, an earthquake in California that displaces the Chinese population. You don't have a call for reproduction. I'm thinking about Puerto Rico today, the way in which those histories are actually tied more to histories of capital and relocation and reproduction on lines of often race and class.
Do you want to go first? Right? Okay. Thanks. Yeah. So the second project is so tentative, but I am presenting my first things on it in like a couple of weeks. So, I need to get my head in the game. So thank you for giving me this to think about. Yeah. So I have a couple of immediate kind of responses that again are kind of based in my very like vibes-based research that has happened so far. One of the things that I've been really thinking with that feels perhaps aligned with what you're getting at is the like writing in Indigenous studies and Black studies about how like apocalypses have already happened. So one of the ways that I'm thinking about framing this project is that this kind of this narrative is an inherently kind of like future white utopia sort of imaginary. In part where like what I'm going to present on in a couple of weeks is, like Elon Musk's anxieties about colonizing Mars because like what, Grimes termed as like the fertility thing. And, thinking about how like white trans people are not reproducing and that is going to like ruin his aspirations of like Mars fascism, So I guess I don't have like a direct answer to like the exactly what you're asking, but I mean, I think there's something really weird going on in the narratives that I've been thinking about so far where like queerness becomes a luxury for like good times and antithetical to species survival, and specifically like antithetical to like species survival when that means like white humanity. And so I think that there's definitely something there that I want to think more about in terms of particular sites where disaster is useful in the service of that imagined like straight white future. And thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. So I'm not sure if the scale of tribe can be translated into the 19th century context that I'm working on, but what's emerging in this context is really a rapid urbanization. And the very focus of the imperial center is actually on men's bodies. And these men's bodies are basically, we're looking at poor peasant male bodies. as opposed to there's a massive literature on the emergence of this like fob westernized man. And I think it's overwritten already because actually all the resources are kind of like mobilized towards disciplining and controlling and creating that like fit body that can be conscripted into the army, especially in the context of 1860s and onwards. We're basically really looking at a bare, straight, or not straight, but basically a man can be conscripted into army and can be militarized very easily, right? So therefore, any context that we're asking questions pertaining to what sexuality meant in the late Ottoman context is definitely dependent on this particular question of where, and also the urban-rural divide in the context of rapid urbanization. And one more thing is really what we're looking at in the 19th century, again, Ottoman context, especially the Arab lands and the Balkans are much more of like autonomous regions where actually Ottomans basically let customary law and customary practices run their time and let them go. So we're basically practically looking at where they consider the regions where they can conscript the army. Is more like a central land for them. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists and to our audience for the questions.